Welcome, everyone. This is part one of a two-part webinar series deemed Native Ag Media Education. The communications teams from IFAI, IAC, and NAF have come together to share their collective wisdom on best practices and effective communication techniques when covering Native American agriculture in the media. Over the next hour, we're going to concentrate on Indian Agriculture 101, discussing Native ag production and tribal food sovereignty, past, present, and future. We're going to give overviews of our organizations, a brief synopsis of Native American history, and then transition into Native American agriculture history. We'll also talk about the strides Native ag has made in modern day agriculture and identify some key areas where Native ag will be next. Part two of this webinar series will be taking place in October and will include a deeper dive into technical practices when working with agriculturalists in the field. So throughout this discussion, you'll notice that we'll be weaving in tradition, innovation, sustenance, and progress. And our hope is that by the end of this webinar, you'll be armed with fresh insights, inspired perspectives, and an even deeper appreciation for the incredible world of Native agriculture. We will save some time at the end of the presentation to answer any questions, but feel free to drop them in the chat box as we go along. So without further ado, let's kick off the event by introducing our first organization that will be speaking today, the Indigenous Food and Agriculture Initiative.
Bonjour, Mary Belzik, Indejna Kas, Potawatomi and Dow. Hello, everyone. My name is Mary Belzik, and I am a member of the Citizen Potawatomi Nation, and I am also the Communications Director at the Indigenous Food and Ag Initiative. And I just want to say, Chi Miigwech, many thanks for joining us here today. We're so grateful to have you. Now I will pass it over to my colleague, Tish.
Hi, my name is Tish Mindeman. I'm the Communications Manager and Program Specialist at IFAI. Today we're going to tell you a little bit about IFAI and a little bit about what our programs do for agriculture. So IFAI was founded by Stacy Leeds and Director Janie Sims Hip. Janie was just recently the General Counsel for the USDA. She just left that position. So we really focus on bringing health and wellness into tribal communities by advancing their healthy food systems along with traditional food systems and bringing all of their knowledge together into one cohesive plan. So we offer subject matter expertise in Indian country through food and agriculture law and policy. We have lawyers on staff that provide that expertise that for free to tribes. We provide strategic analysis when things come out about like the Farm Bill or marker bills or anything like that. We can provide some policy analysis on our website. We also support tribal business and economic development through our tribal enterprise, where our guys go out and they work to help set up departments of agriculture, meat processing plants, things like that. We also invest in the next generation of Native agriculturalists through our youth summit and also through outreach on the University of Arkansas campus. And we have free food safety trainings through the FDA so that growers can become FDA certified. So those are our four buckets: policy and research, tribal enterprise, youth programming, and food safety. And you can find all of that information on our website at indigenousfoodandag.com.
Hello, everyone. My name is Barbara Soule. I am Dene, a citizen of the Navajo Nation, and I am Chief Communications Officer for the Intertribal Agriculture Council. I'm joined today by my colleague Pua, who will introduce herself.
Hello, everyone. My name is Pua Trice. I am Samoan, and I am the Communications Specialist here at IAC.
The Intertribal Agriculture Council is a national Native-led nonprofit that was formed by tribal nations in 1987 and tasked with pursuing and promoting the conservation, development, and use of our agriculture resources for the betterment of our people. Since its founding, IAC has actively supported tribal producers nationwide with on-the-ground technical assistance and services and advocacy for improvements in the policies that govern the landscape in which tribal producers must operate. IAC works to position tribes and tribal producers to make decisions regarding how to feed their communities and build agriculture systems at local and regional levels that create long-term economic security in Indian country. The mission of IAC is to pursue and promote the conservation, development, and use of our agricultural resources for the betterment of Native peoples.
Through our advocacy work, IAC's Policy and Government Relations team aims to increase a broad spectrum of benefits while ensuring our tribes can exercise sovereignty in the agriculture space. Tribal producers represent the full spectrum of agriculture, which varies based on regions and ranges from traditional and subsistence practices to commercial pursuits. To meet the varied needs of producers across 14 regions, IAC's Technical Assistance Network initiated nearly 3,000 outreach and technical assistance activities and logged over 17,000 technical assistance interactions in 2022, more than 850 of these involving tribal youth. IAC's Natural Resources Program works on improving access to conservation planning, technical assistance, management resources, and useful land stewardship tools through trainings and direct assistance. Rooted in the principles and value systems of Indian country, IAC's Regenerative Economies Program provides individual assistance on business and finance solutions that promote healthy and regenerative economic growth. IAC's Youth and Professional Development Program equips Native youth with immersive learning experiences, higher education resources, plus internships, fellowships, and apprenticeships to support upcoming leaders and ensure long-term economic efforts. Revitalizing food economies in Indian country, IAC's American Indian Foods Program provides domestic and international market access opportunities for made and produced by American Indian trademarked products.
Hi, everyone. My name is Whitney Sawney. I'm a citizen of Cherokee Nation and the Director of Communications and Policy at the Native American Agriculture Fund, or NAF for short. Also joining us on the webinar today is Samantha Below. Sam, would you like to say hello?
Hi, everybody. I'm Samantha Below. I am from the Spokane tribe, and I'm the Communications Officer for NAF.
Thanks, Sam. And also on our team is Gabrielle Butter, the Associate Communications Officer, also a citizen of Cherokee Nation. We'll hear from her more during the next webinar in October. So a little bit more about NAF. NAF is a private drawdown trust fund. Our mission is to support Native American farmers and ranchers for the advancement of agriculture through business assistance, agricultural education, technical support, and advocacy services. We are focused on healthy lands, healthy people, and healthy economies, ultimately investing in work to find solutions to the challenges that Native American farmers and ranchers face, to increase access to capital for Native American producers. And part of that impacts areas such as improving food access and increasing food security, diversifying economic development through agriculture in tribal and rural communities, and investing in agricultural efforts that support tribal food systems. NAF is derived from a class action litigation, Keep Siegel v. Vilsack, where claims were settled based on Native American farmers and ranchers and their lack of access to credit and credit servicing. Under the Obama administration, they entered into settlements with Black farmers, Hispanic farmers, female farmers, and also Native American farmers. And after those claims processes occurred, there existed a little bit more than $250 million, and that funding, the Cypre funds, led to the creation of NAF. As I mentioned, we're a drawdown trust fund. We will exist over a period of 20 years and spending down a principal amount through grant making. We were officially founded in 2018, and since that time have provided more than 70 million in grant making. And we fund 4 different entity types, which are on the screen: 501c3 organizations, educational institutions, community development financial institutions, or CDFIs, and tribes, both state and federally recognized. So this is a map of where our funded grantees are, and later in this presentation, you'll learn more about where Native producers are in Indian country, and you can see the demand for our funding according to the geographical regions with the most Native producers in ag production. As I mentioned, we have invested more than 70 million in grant making, and part of our work also includes investments as founding funders for 3 separate entities that are now their own organizations. First is the Native Agriculture Financial Services, which will apply for other financing institution status within the farm credit system. We are thrilled about this because it's the first agriculture lending entity of its kind within the farm credit system dedicated to Native American agricultural lending. They will do their first participatory loans with CDFIs, and we're, like I said, very proud of the entity that will increase access to capital for Native producers. Additionally is the Tribal Agriculture Fellowship Program, which is a nonprofit institution with the mission of creating opportunities for students to advance their education with the purpose of preserving and promoting the legacy of agriculture and tribal communities. This is a funded fellowship program, and they have their first few graduates of their Native Ag Professionals cohort most recently. So we're excited to see where they take their professional careers within agriculture. This program helps with tuition and provides an incredible opportunity for professional development to aid Native students in achieving their educational goals. And the third entity is a sovereign equity fund. They are focused on transforming and increasing investments in Indian country by transforming food systems. And they have just begun their first round of grants with tribal colleges and universities, and they will announce more in November. So we know that there are still many challenges and barriers that our tribes and Native agricultural producers face, such as disruptions to the food supply chain, like the pandemic, or different climate-related disruptions that can exacerbate gaps in our food systems and disproportionately impact tribal communities, often in the most remote areas of our nation. Our communities are in the middle of food and credit deserts. This illuminates a greater need for further investment in rural agriculture infrastructure that can be applied as solutions to these disruptions. We need robust systems that serve as transportation hubs and food processing facilities, distribution channels for all of those different agricultural products and services. You're going to hear later in this presentation from the Intertribal Agriculture Council on how those barriers are being addressed. But we know that the economic value of agricultural production in Indian country is about $3.5 billion annually for Native producers. What we support at NAF are investments in things like farm production, from processing and packaging and transportation to developing infrastructure. But what we know is that when our local and regional economies capture more of the food dollar to stay in those regional economies, there's a potential value of Native food and agricultural sectors to reach about $45.4 billion in potential value annually. And this can even surpass gaming as economic opportunities in Indian country. And what we know is that when Indian country's agriculture infrastructure is healthy, rural America's impact is also healthy. And on the next slide, you can see the tremendous impact that tribes have as often the backbone of our different local and regional economies. And so next, we're going to go into more of a background on Indian Country 101, where we will provide more background and historical context.
There are 574 federally recognized nations and 334 reservations across 35 states. In 2018, the Reclaiming Native Truth Project found that 78% of Americans have limited knowledge or are completely unaware of American Indians and Alaska Natives. 40% of Americans continue to believe that Native Americans don't even exist. When writing about Native peoples, it's important to research and understand how your work can feed into the invisibility and erasure of tribal histories. With over 9.7 million American Indian and Alaska Native people in the US, it's important to understand that words matter. The goal of this webinar is to provide you with resources to understand the complexity of tribes and tribal identities, our impact in the field of agriculture, and the diverse ways we choose to describe our own cultures and histories. For example, we use the term Indian in the field of agriculture, despite concerns with its historical and contemporary implications, primarily because of its presence in federal law. This usage reflects the complexity of cultural, legal, and political dynamics that shape the ways in which Native communities navigate their identities and relationships within broader society. Each community maintains a unique self-perspective, and agreement on terminology may not be universal. The preferred term is what an individual or tribal community employs. Replicating their terminology or inquiring about their preference is advisable. Our hope is that you come away from this webinar with an understanding of how important it is to refer to Native peoples in the present tense and to ask individuals and tribes who you're writing about their identifying terminology preferences.
Well, before we can talk about now or the future of Native food and agriculture, I think it's important to know the past and talk about the past. So this graph on the right does a great job of breaking down Indian country history into a quick and easy to digest way. And one of the major things I would like to highlight is that through each of these periods, our food and agriculture systems were disrupted in one way or another. And that still impacts us today as people. But let's start at the removal period at 1828. This was a time where tribes like my tribe, the Citizen Potawatomi, were taken from their lands west of and put west of the Mississippi. And so many tribes have removal stories. And if not full-on removal, they still have stories of land loss. And all of this contributes to our ability to access traditional foods that have sustained our ancestors since time immemorial. But then we move into allotment and assimilation period. This is where we begin to see even greater land loss. For my tribe in particular, we were actually the first ones to try allotment through our 1861 treaty. And what this did, we were supposed to be given some provisions, which I'll get into in the treaties slide. That's the next slide. But it was a time of tremendous land loss for us, even into the end of the 1800s, beginning of the 1900s with the Dawes Act. But then we move into the 1930s, and they begin to realize that allotments didn't work. And that passed with the Indian Reorganization Act of 1934. But not too long after that, the termination period started to happen, where tribes were having to fight for their federal recognition. And it was a really scary time for many. But then we get to move into a time that I find pretty hopeful, which is the self-determination and self-governance period of the 1980s. And for my tribe in particular, we were able to really grow from this and be able to provide services to our tribal citizens and other tribal citizens in our area and really improve and expand. And we had $500 in our account back in the day, and now we have millions. We annually bring in millions to the local economy. So it's really awesome to be able to see that growth from the 1980s through one simple act that we'll talk about here in a little bit as well. But that period was really awesome. And there were also some downturns as well because of some of the economic factors that were going on within Indian country, food and agriculture, and honestly, agriculture across the country. So I would love to hear a little bit more about that.
So during the 1980s farm crisis, Native agricultural producers were 5 times more likely to face bankruptcy than their non-Native counterparts, excluding them from federal agency aid and most USDA commodity and conservation programs. In recognition of the vital role agriculture plays in Native communities and in response to requests from tribal leaders, Congress directed the Secretary of the Interior to provide a report to Congress on the use of drought relief funding and challenges faced by Native producers across the nation. In a July 1986 report, the Task Force on Indian Economic Development recommended to improve agricultural conditions and support tribal goals in Indian country, ultimately forming the Intertribal Agriculture Council to ensure support and representation of Native producers in U.S. Starting with the 1990 Farm Bill, IAC and its partners have been advocating for policy solutions on behalf of tribal governments and tribal producers in food and agriculture production.
Thank you for that background information. I don't think that any of us here today could exist without the formation of the Intertribal Ag Council. So they've been really pivotal in being able to do all of this work in Indian country food and agriculture that's been able to happen since then. So they're super key in this timeline when we're talking about the history of food and agriculture in Indian country. But as we're talking about that, we can't forget federal treaties and what they are. So talking about tribal self-governance and the history of food and agriculture, we have to talk about treaties, because treaties are the highest law in the land between two nations. These treaties have impacted our land laws, but also many included provisions for farming, agriculture, fishing, hunting, and even value-added opportunities like establishing mills. That's something that one of my ancestors did, was he was able to establish a grist mill. So they set out to make us yeoman farmers and take on Western agriculture. My tribe happens to be the most treated tribe. We hold more treaties with the federal government than any other tribe. So it's something that a lot of us know quite a bit about, but so many tribes have similar stories to us. And we were supposed to be given support through some of our treaties to start our farms and be given equipment, but that didn't happen. And we were also supposed to be able to have some time to establish our farms before we were taxed. Again, that didn't happen either. So a lot of us lost our lands once again through that. And it was a really trying time. But I think it just goes back to show that so many of these treaties, there's over 370 of them, almost every single one of them tie back to Indian country, food and agriculture, one way or another, and still impact us today. So I think it's really critical that we take a little bit of time to talk about those, because it moves us into tribal sovereignty. So what is tribal sovereignty? Well, to explain that a little bit, I like to tell folks to think about a tribe the same way that you would think about the federal government's relationship with Canada. So keep in mind, we have 574 plus tribes, all are unique and all are sovereign nations. But because of this, we have this nation to nation relationship with the federal government. And the federal government can't go about working with us in the same way that they would go about working with like a state or a local municipality. But sovereignty, like this slide says, is the authority of tribal nations to self-govern and exercise self-determination. So what is that? Well, we like to look at it as this magic number in Indian country as 638. So 638 is essentially the 1975 passage of the Indian Self-Determination and Education Assistance Act. So what this did was provide tribes the opportunity to self-administer some of their programs. It did not open the opportunity to all federal agencies. And when I'm talking about programs, I'm talking about programs that are included in the treaties that are supposed to be provided to tribes. So for my tribe in particular, which I'll keep going back to that because that's what I know, we were able to start overseeing our healthcare and some of our education. And I know that I'm going to be taken care of when I walk into my healthcare facility. And it's increased the amount of folks we're able to serve, because we also serve other tribal citizens in the area, and it's improved the care. So it's stretching that taxpayer dollar as far as possible. But what I think is key is that my tribe had the choice to enter into those agreements, and other tribes need to also have that choice, but we don't have that choice when it comes to USDA programs. So that farm and ag side, that is only very limited that it's ever been able to happen, which was enacted through the 2018 Farm Bill. That's the first time we ever saw it in USDA programs. And it was only in 2 different areas of the Farm Bill. So 2 programs, the food distribution program on Indian reservations, and then one within the forestry title. But what we've been able to see, those tribes who've been able to participate in those pilot projects, we've been able to see them really grow local food economies and reestablish those traditional trade networks, because they're able to go out and source locally. So they're often sourcing from local tribal producers in their area or other producers that are in their area. So it's very, very high quality, fresh ingredients, and also it's often traditional. So we're able to get some of those traditional foods back on the plates of our people, which is so, so important. So that's been awesome to see. But again, I'll go back to tribal choice and being able to put tribes in the driver's seat and decide what works best for them. Do they want to take on these programs? And being able to give them that choice. Also, if they're not taking on those programs themselves, it's because they know that that's what's best for them. But again, it's allowing tribes to look at what the needs are locally and be able to address them. So that's what's really cool about 638. And it's really cool to also see everything that's happened through the very limited opportunities in Indian country. But it seems like whenever we're given an opportunity, we can really capitalize on it and make it something amazing, which I love to see.
So just giving a little bit of background, and when you're talking about different trust responsibilities and working with tribes and Indian country agriculture in general, it's important to also have an understanding of the complex legal frameworks for tribes and Native producers and what differentiates Native producers from other underserved populations. And that's their unique legal and political status of the tribes and tribal lands. Many Native American farmers and ranchers operate on those tribal lands, which often have those complex ownership arrangements, and they can make it difficult to secure loans, or use land as collateral due to those legal complexities and limitations. Tribal lands in the U.S. can also be held in trust by the federal government, which can make tribal land leasing subject to those complex regulations as well. And these regulations can make the leasing process lengthy and difficult to navigate. It can limit economic development opportunities for tribes. And additionally, the unique legal and political status of tribal lands, it means that Native American producers do not always have the same access to credit in the same way that non-Native producers do. So there are different policies and practices that have disenfranchised or displaced Native American communities that have led to lack of resources like financial capital. This has created those systemic barriers to accessing the capital and credit for Native American producers and limiting their ability to invest in their own agricultural operations. So that's why it's important to understand the complexities of those different trust responsibilities.
Thank you, Whitney, for highlighting that. And that federal trust responsibility also goes into, I talked a little bit about that unique relationship that we have with federal government and how we have a different way of communicating and working together. Well, there's official, it's called consultation, and these are official meetings between nation to nation. So that's between tribal elected officials or their proxies, so those who they have appointed to be their voice, and the federal government. And us at IFAI, from the amazing support of Mazone, have put together a guide for USDA. So if you would like to check that out and see what some of the best practices are, what are some of the things that aren't the best practices, please feel free to check that out. It's at indigenousfoodandag.com and just gives you a little bit of a background on how that unique relationship works. And I think this is a really good quote that helps segue into our next thought, which, what is Indian country agriculture?
So what is Indian agriculture? As the original land stewards of this country, Native peoples have a deep-rooted history in agriculture, cultivating profound connections through sustainable practices and conservation. Tribal relationships with the land go beyond resource utilization, emphasizing an understanding of nature's interconnectedness and the responsibility to preserve and protect the environment for future generations. Traditional ecological knowledge, or TEK, is a body of observations, oral and written knowledge, practices, and beliefs developed by tribes and indigenous peoples through their interaction and experience with the environment. TEK honors the unique knowledge and expertise of Native communities, encompassing a broad range of skills and expertise from traditional hunting and fishing methods to medicinal plants and observing seasonal changes.
Okay, so what is unique about Indian agriculture? Why should you care? Here are some stats to show you a glimpse of the impact of native ag as represented in the 2017 Census of Agriculture. And I'm pretty sure Whitney mentioned this earlier, but native operated farms have sold over 3.54 billion in agricultural products. Native producers are highly concentrated in 4 states, with Arizona being at the top at 19,481, followed by Oklahoma, New Mexico, and Texas. The average age for a native producer is 56.5 years, and the majority of our producers are cattle producers. So as you may have recognized, it has been several years since this data was taken, and we are waiting for new ag census data to be released, which will most likely be in 2024. So just putting it on your radar right now that this may be an intriguing news story for showcasing the growth of Native American agriculture over the years. Another thing this represents is how important data is to Indian country. It shows that we are here, we have been here, and then that there are major opportunities for Native farmers, ranchers, and producers.
And I'm sure many of you know, as media professionals, communicators, journalists, that data is critical it's a critical piece for storytelling. When you're writing about agriculture and you want to narrow in on agriculture in Indian country, finding data to support your story and share perspectives to help your audience understand can be challenging. Often, the data about agriculture does not specifically identify Indigenous populations. There is, as Sam mentioned, an agriculture census data set that comes out, but what we know is that it has its gaps. It doesn't fully capture the breadth of impact of native agricultural production and the growing population of native producers. Some of that is skewed and doesn't always accurately represent the full picture of agriculture. And at NAF, that's why we are proud to invest in projects that support tribes and tribal-led entities to gather their own data for agricultural purposes and support surveys that help tell the story of food systems in Indian country. In 2020, we partnered with IFAI and the Food Research and Action Center to conduct a survey on food security during COVID-19 pandemic. And from that survey, we learned that 49% of American Indians and Alaska Natives experienced food insecurity during COVID. That's a very significant number. And I mentioned earlier that some of the disruptions of our communities that we face come from the pandemic, to also being on the front lines of climate-related emergencies. But that is why when you're telling the story, I encourage you to shift your mindset, change the narrative from disparities to success. So for example, if you're telling the story of food insecurity, also tell the story of what tribes are doing to feed their own people in times of crisis. Also, what we know from that survey that we did during the COVID-19 pandemic is that when tribal communities faced the reality of possibly not knowing where their next meal would come from, they turned to their tribal governments for help. Tribes administered food access programs, they supplied food boxes and community garden kits to community members and elders. So what you see in the slide is a number that represents a disparity. The 49% of American Indians and Alaska Natives experience food insecurity. Yet the real story is about how tribes led in feeding not only their own people, but the community at large, and often served as the backbone of the economy and the community at that time, even going beyond food systems. They also provided support through their health systems, as Maribel was mentioning earlier. They would administer COVID tests and vaccines. But the purpose of showing you this data and this data point here is to reflect the human impact behind the numbers to help you tell the story. So what are tribes doing to address some of those barriers, and what innovative approaches are tribes and tribal producers leading? So at NAF, we're investing in native agriculture. That's what we do. We're increasing access to capital. We have a network of more than 300 grantees across Indian country, all with their own unique projects and success stories. And they're doing incredible work on the ground. IAC has been here for decades, providing technical support and much more. IFAI leads on policy research and education. IAC is the umbrella for the Native Farm Bill Coalition, which identifies and advocates for various policy priorities in the omnibus Farm Bill legislation. And all of our organizations support educational and youth programming to ensure that the next generation has the support and financial capital they need to continue this work for generations to come. So what we're seeing is the development of exciting new ventures for food processing and food distribution through hubs for food access, which you'll learn a little bit more from IAC as we go throughout this presentation.
Whitney did a great job of summarizing it, and we all three of our organizations often work hand in hand together too. So, but at IFAI, one of the major things that we do is going out and helping tribes identify opportunities or establish departments of agriculture, or help them get a strong legal foundation through our tribal food and ag code. Having that strong legal foundation, because we are all unique nations, is really, really critical to being able to support the goals of the tribe itself when it comes to their food sovereignty and their ag systems and what they want to see. So those are some of the ways that we help tribes support their food and ag systems, which then goes on to support their tribal producers.
On rural development and the hubs Whitney mentioned earlier, in partnership with the USDA, the Intertribal Agriculture Council, Akiptan, the Indian Land Tenure Foundation, and the Indigenous Food and Agriculture Initiative, will develop a coordinated national food system development plan to support the growth and expansion of American Indian and Alaska Native food businesses. The focus will be on small and mid-sized food and farm businesses, with more than 65% of the funding allocated for capacity building awards. This initiative provides tribal producers with more access to agricultural resources to realize economic growth in Indian country. We are currently in the planning phase of this initiative with a launch date in 2024. The Native Farm Bill Coalition, or NFBC, is on a mission to advance the policy priorities of Native American producers in the upcoming 2023 Farm Bill through a strong, united voice. NFBC was formed through the joint efforts of the founding members, Intertribal Agriculture Council, the Shakopee Mdewakanton Sioux Community, Indigenous Food and Agriculture Initiative, and the National Congress of American Indians. The 2018 Farm Bill was signed into law in December 2018 with 63 separate provisions that benefit Indian country, an unprecedented degree of success. These 63 provisions impact everything from strengthening tribal self-governance and the management of nutrition programs to investing in economic development opportunities. Scan the QR code here to view the 2022 NFBC Gaining Ground Report that discusses successes from the 2018 Farm Bill and argues for the significant progress to be made in the 2023 Farm Bill. Since January, the coalition hosted tribal leaders, Native producers, and youth during 6 fly-ins to Washington, D.C. to speak directly with members of Congress, their staff, and the Biden administration about Indian country's priorities for the 2023 Farm Bill. Regenerative agriculture is a holistic approach to revitalizing land and ecological systems. It focuses on improving soil's ability to regenerate over time by involving the whole farm ecosystem, including humans and wildlife. It is a mindset that is already inherent in tribal producers, and many of these practices originated in Native communities to grow crops and raise livestock. Some of the approaches Native producers associate with regenerative agriculture include maintaining living roots during as much of the year as possible. This usually involves growing cover crops, minimizing tillage, integration of ancestral practices with modern practices, traditional seed saving, and maintaining or planting native plant species. Through regenerative agriculture projects, IAC has partnered with Environmental Defense Fund to better understand the full impact regenerative agriculture provides to Native producers.
Great. So we have presented all of this information to you. It's a lot of details, but there's a lot of opportunity to take a deeper dive as well. But what we're trying to help you understand as ag media professionals and journalists, communicators, is that when you're writing a story about agriculture or economic developments, food security, food systems, pause and ask yourself a question. What about tribes? What about Native American producers? Am I completely capturing the full picture? Native people were the original stewards of this land and have been sustaining their communities, protecting their lands, and feeding their people for generations. So what traditional innovative solutions exist within these sovereign nations within our country? And that's what we hope that your takeaway will be from this presentation.
Wow, thank you. That is all we have for you today. Thank you to all of our presenters, and thanks everyone who was in attendance. I know we covered a lot of information, but we hope we have planted a few seeds, pun intended, and have given you some insight of Native agriculture, the past, present, and future. Before we get to your questions, I just wanted to remind you that part 2 of this webinar series will take place on October 12th at 2 p.m. Eastern Time. For that webinar, we are going to focus on telling the story of tribal agriculture, building relationships in Indian country, and best practices. We have a few guest speakers that will be joining us, so don't forget, set those calendars right now. Don't forget to join us. And now let's pop over and see if we have some questions in our chat box. Okay, one of the first questions is, what are some of your favorite practices for moving through the awkwardness of USDA language that might not reflect an individual or a tribe's preference? Do we have any volunteers on our panel that would like to take this?
I feel like that's something that we do day in and day out as communicators in this space, because we work a lot with USDA and with tribes and tribal producers. So, but what's my favorite practice? I think I try to just walk in the shoes of a tribal producer, and I grew up on a farm. I'm a former producer myself too. So I just kind of go back to that and trying to think of where I came from and how I received that information and how I would like it to be received to others. So that's just something that I do, is I try to walk in other people's shoes, but I'm sure other folks have some good tips as well.
Okay.
Yeah, I would just add that, you know, IC is always trying to make sure that the way that we communicate is relatable to all of our stakeholders as well. USDA, you know, tends to be a little bit more heady maybe sometimes. And so just being able to kind of decipher down into a relatable language that, you know, any small community, anyone across the nation can relate to is kind of how we approach that.
A lot of the times when USDA comes out with a new rule or some sort of new thing that comes out from them, we have lawyers and policy experts on staff who will write up a policy analysis, and it'll go up on our website, that are available to any tribal producer or tribal member who can see what it says kind of in plain language.
Okay, thank you for that question. And next we're going to go to a question from Autumn. She is a graduate student planning to study Indigenous food sovereignty. Who would be best to speak with about this? All of us. We are going to put together an email after this webinar that's going to include the recording and all of our contact information along with our organization information. And we also are very busy at conferences and traveling to meetings. So if there's ever an opportunity where maybe we post on social media that we'll be in attendance at these conferences, we would love for you to swing by our booths and talk to us specifically or gather more information. So definitely welcome any conversation with anyone out there.
I would also add that IAC in particular has it's called a youth program, but we really serve youth and young professionals. We oftentimes have scholarships and fellowships available to students. So definitely check out our website as well under the youth section, even though you may not be a youth specifically. As a young adult who is entering the field, we have a lot of resources through that program.
Awesome. This question is from Alexandria Cruz. How can we approach the conditions, climate change in a way that uplifts our communities? That's a great question.
It's a very, very good question. I think going back to those knowledge keepers too, and oftentimes tribal communities are on the edge and experiencing climate change before other folks are, because we are in rural communities. We are out where a lot of disasters are happening, and it's really unfortunate, but also there's a lot of knowledge there. And I personally believe that it's going to take working together with Western knowledge and the traditional knowledge somehow to be able to survive in the future. We have traditional stories about that. So it's just, thinking about how do we want to work together and how do we? And it's very, very complicated. I don't think that there's really one good answer to this question. It's a very complicated issue, but it is something that touches tribal communities, I think, before it touches sometimes other communities.
I think that one thing that is important is making sure that when tribes enter into like research with climate change scientists and things like that, that one, the traditions are respected, but also that the tribe is the one who retains that research, so that they can make sure that they're being accurately portrayed and that their traditional knowledge is being kept safe.
Okay, awesome. I love all these questions that we're getting. I'm just trying to keep it in order. Okay, David asks, what is some advice for new farmers with little agricultural experience looking to break into ag production? You mentioned cattle production. What are some other emerging areas for native ag producers?
I could at least give you a place to start. Would be on IAC's website. We have, a regional map that you can find your regional representative to connect with personally through our technical assistance network, and they would have so many resources for you. They're every day working with USDA and NRCS, and have a lot of different market resources for you to learn about how to build a business. Certainly attending our conferences. We have an annual conference in December in Las Vegas, where there will be a number of different sessions to learn from and find resources from. But maybe somebody else could help give a little bit more about like what those other ag opportunities would be other than ranching.
So I'll just hop in real quick here. At NAF, we fund 4 of those different buckets that Whitney had mentioned earlier in the webinar. And if you missed that, we fund tribes, CDFIs, and 501c3s. And what's the other bucket, Gabby, that I'm missing right now? There's 4.
Did you already say educational organizations?
Educational organizations. Yes, thank you. So we fund 4 those different buckets in regards to agriculture. Our request for application process opens in the spring. But prior to that, kind of having a game plan of getting it in, and just kind of what Barbara had said earlier, just start networking from where you're at and see who's around you. And I mean, I'm going to be honest, in with some of our grantees, which is on our website, that link will be shared with you in this email that we're going to send out. Our grantees are all across the nation, all different geographical locations. And so agriculture looks different in those areas. And so one of our jobs as communicators is being able to tell the stories of those grantees. And so one of my favorite stories that I've told so far is this gentleman that runs the Horse Education Foundation, and his name is Dr. Good. And so he had the idea of traveling around with a mobile horseshoeing unit to rural areas so he could save them money, that they didn't have to do the horseshoeing themselves. He led them through this 2-week process. And so like that's an area of agriculture that maybe people wouldn't necessarily think of, because native agriculture is so diverse. And, you know, any chance that you get to start any sort of ag production or anything like that, we are in full support of. So I would just say, if you're having a hard time getting started or need other ideas, reach out to us individually, because as communicators for these different organizations, we know majority of the people that are out there doing the work. So if you have any questions or comments, feel free to email us individually.
I think that the other good place to look is tribal colleges and universities. A lot of times they will have an ag department. So you can, if you don't know a lot about agriculture, they're going to be a great resource for you to learn about what types of agriculture there is in your area, but also like how to start that ag business.
Awesome. And so we'll just keep moving along here. What collaborations are you most excited about or interested in creating with the wider media community? More or less, where do you think we, as the media community, can be most helpful? And honestly, that's the question that we're addressing with this webinar series. So if anybody wants to take time or share your thoughts on that on the panel, go for it.
I think it's just telling more of the story, what's happening on the ground, and the actual people behind the data, behind what you're trying to say, and actually uplifting those stories, because there are so many incredible stories that exist out there. So I think just having that, and I would love to see more tribal newspapers cover agriculture, more local newspapers and regional newspapers. I mean, for me personally, I always think really big. I would love to see it in all corners of media, more highlights of all the amazing things that are happening in Indian country, especially when it comes to our food and ag.
I would add that, you know, we also have this really unique opportunity that was mentioned in the webinar with the regional food business centers. IAC and its partners, to include IFAI, are part of the National Intertribal Food Business Center. And, you know, we really have such a unique opportunity with that partnership with the USDA to expand the voice and reach and visibility of Native producers. So, you know, there are going to be a number of regional food business centers, but because ours is national, you know, we just really have an opportunity to tell this huge story about how important Native food producers are across this nation to putting food on your table, whether it's regionally or nationally or not. So being able to kind of build those stories into the mainstream media will be really impactful, to see representation of Native producers right alongside all of the other producers in the country.
And then with that too, I would just like to say, like, again, sharing our stories is helpful because of just how diverse Native agriculture is. And so agriculture doesn't have to be, you know, just out there farming. It's one of the areas, yes, but because agriculture is so diverse, we just kind of cover all these different areas, like the CDFIs that we had spoken about, the educational organizations. Like, it's not just farming per se. That's just one area of agriculture. So I think just kind of putting it in the sense of what we're doing in native agriculture that helps not only our tribes and our people, but just America in general. So we will go ahead and get to the next question. And it is, Madison, I'm interested in the intersection of food systems and the carbon removal industry. Is there someone you recommend reaching out to for this specific intersection? Do you guys have any ideas of who?
I have one idea. I'm not as familiar with this specific piece of ag, but we have our regenerative economies program, and Tommy Peterson leads that program for our Intertribal Agriculture Council, who would probably be a great resource. Certainly check our website to find her contact information, and that would be a good place to start, I think.
Awesome. Okay. And then Kelly asks, have you worked through public-private partnerships, helping tribes and tribal organizations with access to capital to support regenerative agricultural practices?
I think I can chime in real quick on this. So it's kind of a buzzword, regenerative agriculture, but it's like Pua said on one of her slides, it's kind of inertly just part of what we do as Native food and agriculturalists. But I think a big thing at IFAI that we help do is whenever there's any grants that come out when it comes to conservation opportunities, that we help share that information. And then we also help with facilitating a group of tribal leaders and the NRCS within USDA with coming up with what things need to be fixed within the organization, within NRCS, to better serve tribal citizens and tribal producers and tribes when it comes to conservation. So those are just a few ways that we help with that. So access to capital as in grants and sometimes matches and things of that sort with USDA. But I know that our other partners do a little bit more when it actually comes to the capital side of things.
I know that we're right at time, but I would like to just quickly say that through our regenerative agriculture projects, one of our objectives is to leverage data to support new and existing credit offerings to Native producers. And I'll go ahead and share a link to that project with you so that way you can look it over in further detail.
Awesome. Thank you guys so much for your questions. I hope that we got, again, planted some of those seeds. We'll be sending out that email that includes this recording along with some of the resources we just mentioned. Again, our organization and contact information. But thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you to our panelists. And don't forget to join our next webinar where we're going to take a deeper dive into best practices when covering Native ag in the media. That is set for October 12th, 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. So have a great day, everyone. See you next month.
Bye, everyone.